Thomas Grayson had become part of the city's background noise, just another figure wrapped in layers of old fabric, pushing a squeaky cart along cracked sidewalks. People passed him without really seeing him. They glanced through him like smudges on a window, quickly moving on with their lives. Maybe once they might have stared, but over time, even curiosity fades. In Midtown Detroit, men like Thomas were as common as broken streetlights and boarded-up stores. He wore a heavy, olive-drab military coat, so faded it looked gray under the winter sun. His knit hat was unraveling at the top. His gloves didn't match. His boots were held together with duct tape and hope. In his cart, a rusted toolbox, an AM radio that hadn't worked since Clinton was president, and a thermos that always seemed to be empty but warm in his hand. No one asked where he came from. No one knew that Thomas had once owned a small electronics repair shop on 12 Mile Road. A modest space with white walls, cluttered shelves, and a smell of solder that clung to your clothes. It was called Grayson Fix-It, painted in blue block letters on a glass window that had long since been shattered by time or vandals. Thomas used to be Mr. Grayson. He used to wear clean shirts and tell bad jokes while fixing people's radios, microwaves, old cassette players. People came not just for the repairs, but for the way he spoke to them, like they mattered. Back then, he had Linda. She was soft-spoken, with eyes that smiled before her mouth did. Linda had worked part-time at the library and full-time on Thomas's heart. They met at a community dance in '84, married within a year, and had a son named Matthew who, at 6, declared his father a wizard who could fix anything. That was another life. When Linda got sick, when the coughing turned into tests, and the tests into bills, Thomas did what he knew how to do: fix things. He sold tools, downsized the shop, worked longer hours. But cancer doesn't care about effort. It grows anyway. Linda died in the fall of 2003. She passed away in a hospice bed that smelled too clean, under a flickering light bulb Thomas couldn't bring himself to fix. He was holding her hand when it went limp. That moment, the soft letting go, was when everything in Thomas's world cracked. But the real shatter came later. Matthew was 17 then. Grief made him loud, angry, and cold. He blamed Thomas for being poor, for not trying harder, for not saving her. They fought in the kitchen 2 days after the funeral. Words were exchanged that couldn't be unsaid. And then Matthew was gone. No note, no call, just the echo of a slamming door and the feeling of failure crawling up the walls like mold. Thomas closed the shop 6 months later. There wasn't anything left to fix, not really. The world had become too digital, too fast. People threw things away before he could even open them up. And inside, he felt the same, disposable, irrelevant. He sold what remained, tools, parts, shelves. He pawned the watch Linda gave him on their 10th anniversary. He gave away the cat. One day he just left. That was 17 winters ago. Since then, Thomas had learned the rhythm of the streets. He knew which churches served hot soup on Thursdays, which dumpsters behind bakeries might still have day-old bread, which gas stations let you use the restroom without buying anything. He learned how to stay warm without a fire, how to sleep with one eye open, how to look harmless but invisible. He didn't beg, never did. Pride? Maybe. Or maybe it was just stubbornness. Linda used to call him stone-headed, her way of softening the fact that he rarely asked for help. Some nights, Thomas talked to her, not out loud, just quietly, in the space behind his eyes where she still lived. Today, the sky was a pale white, the kind of overcast that promised snow but never delivered. Thomas was walking his usual loop, Midtown to West End and back. His hip ached more than usual. A cold wind slipped through the holes in his coat. He stopped by his usual spot behind Westwood Market, a supermarket that had been boarded up for years. Most people didn't bother with it, but sometimes the back dumpster had expired canned goods or slightly stale bread in sealed bags. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept him from starving. As he turned the corner, his boots scuffed something soft. A blanket? He bent down. No, it was just a torn towel. He almost walked away. Then he heard it. A sound. Faint. Wavering. It wasn't the cry of a cat. Too sharp. Too desperate. Thomas's heart stuttered. He moved slowly toward the dumpster, hands trembling. He lifted the heavy green lid with effort, the hinges screeching in protest. Inside, nestled between black trash bags and crushed cardboard, were two infants. Newborns, a boy and a girl. Their skin was bluish. They were barely clothed. One of them whimpered, his tiny hand twitching. The girl was quieter, eyes closed, her chest rising too slowly. Thomas froze. He didn't breathe. This couldn't be real. But it was. He reached in with shaking arms, pulled them both out. The cold bit into his fingers. His coat, his only coat, came off without hesitation. He wrapped them tightly against his chest, one on each side, pressing them to his warmth. "You're okay," he whispered, voice cracked and hoarse. "I got you now." And just like that, his legs moved, down the alley, across the street, past honking horns and stunned pedestrians, toward the only place he thought could save them. Mercy General Hospital, the same place where he once held Linda's hand. This time, he wasn't walking toward death. He was running toward life. The hospital doors burst open as Thomas stumbled inside, clutching the two infants against his chest. The warmth from his body was fading fast, and the babies weren't moving much anymore. His boots slipped slightly on the freshly mopped tile floor. Heads turned. A nurse at the reception desk looked up, startled. "Help," he croaked. "Please help them." Chaos unfolded instantly. Within seconds, nurses sprang into motion. One of them, young, red-haired, with a stethoscope bouncing against her chest, rushed forward. "Oh my God," she gasped, carefully taking one of the babies from Thomas's arms. Another nurse followed suit. They moved quickly, expertly, disappearing into the hallway with the two small bundles of life. Thomas stood there, panting, hands empty, chest heaving. He didn't realize he was crying until he felt the tears freeze on his cheeks. A security guard approached him cautiously. "Sir, are you hurt?" Thomas shook his head. "No, just them. I found them in a dumpster." The nurse from the front desk was already on the phone, presumably with the pediatric unit. Someone brought a chair. Someone else brought water. No one knew what to do with the man in the oversized coat, now reduced to nothing but bones and grief. Eventually, a woman in a white coat approached. Her ID badge read, "Dr. Angela Harris, Chief of Pediatrics." She crouched beside Thomas, eyes sharp but not unkind. "I'm Dr. Harris. Can you tell me what happened?" Thomas nodded slowly. "I was walking behind Westwood Market. I heard crying. I thought maybe, I don't know, but then I saw them in the dumpster, wrapped in nothing." His voice cracked. "I took off my coat. I brought them here. I didn't know where else." "You did the right thing," Dr. Harris said softly, then added, "We'll take care of them now. Do you know their names?" Thomas shook his head. "Do you know who their parents are?" "No idea." She paused, studying him. "Do you have ID? A place to stay?" Thomas hesitated. This was the part he hated. The unraveling. The unspoken assumption that people like him didn't belong here. Between places," he admitted quietly. She nodded slowly, then stood. Her tone shifted. "I'll need to alert Child Protective Services and hospital administration. We'll have to document everything. You understand?" "Of course," Thomas whispered. "I just want them to live." Dr. Harris walked away. A nurse lingered for a moment longer before turning to follow. Thomas was left sitting in the hospital hallway, feeling as cold as the streets he had just left. Time passed. An hour. Then another. No one offered answers, but no one asked him to leave either. Just as he was about to drift into uneasy sleep, a soft voice pulled him back. "Hey, still here?" Thomas looked up. It was the red-haired nurse, the first one who had taken the babies. Her name tag read Rebecca Monroe. "I brought you some tea," she said, handing him a paper cup. "It's not much, but it's hot." He accepted it with trembling hands. "Thank you. They're stable," she added. "The babies." The boy was hypothermic, but responded quickly. The girl, she's slower, but she's fighting. A breath of relief escaped his lungs. Did they give them names?" he asked. Rebecca smiled. "We call them Elijah and Ava. Temporary, of course, but something to hold on to." Thomas repeated the names under his breath like a prayer. Elijah and Ava. Rebecca sat beside him on the floor, her back to the wall. Most people would have walked past that alley. Thomas didn't respond right away. Then, quietly, I almost did. She turned her head. I've been walking past things for years, he said. People mostly. Pain. My own. Others. I thought maybe if I just kept moving, I wouldn't feel anymore. Rebecca didn't say anything, but she didn't leave either. He added, but they cried. And I couldn't unhear it. They sat in silence, two strangers who had briefly become part of the same moment. Later that night, a woman from Child Protective Services arrived. Her name was Ms. Dayton, and she had the kind of voice that made everything sound like paperwork. We appreciate your action, Mr. Thomas, he replied. Mr. Thomas? No, just Thomas. She raised an eyebrow, but didn't press. I understand you found the children. Did you notice anything else around them? A note? Personal items? No, just trash. And towels. We'll begin a case file. There will be an investigation. The children will be placed into temporary foster care once they're discharged. Unfortunately, unless you're a registered foster parent or have legal guardianship. I know, he interrupted. I just wanted to make sure they made it. Her expression softened a little. Well, thanks to you they did. She left soon after. Thomas remained. By morning, he was still sitting outside the nursery window, watching Elijah's tiny hand twitch in sleep, Ava's chest rise slowly but surely. Rebecca returned with a small meal, scrambled eggs and toast. She sat beside him again, no questions asked. Over the next few days, Thomas became a fixture in the hallway. He slept in the waiting area. Rebecca snuck him extra food when she could. Dr. Harris remained professionally distant, but even she acknowledged that his presence was calming. For the babies, for the staff, maybe even for herself. On the fourth day, Thomas looked through the glass and whispered, "They're going to take them, aren't they?" Rebecca hesitated, then nodded. "They'll find good homes." "I'm not asking to keep them," Thomas said quickly. "I know I can't. I don't want them to think the world is cold." Rebecca's eyes welled up, but she blinked it away. "Then you already did your part." That night, Elijah and Ava were transferred to a foster care agency. Thomas stood at the front of the hospital, watching the social worker's car pull away. Rebecca stood beside him. "You gave them a beginning," she said. Thomas didn't respond. He just stared at the taillights until they vanished. He thought about Matthew then, his own son, who had once needed him, and whom he had somehow lost anyway. Maybe this time, someone else would get it right. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. 2 days had passed since the infants were taken into protective custody, but Thomas remained a silent fixture outside the pediatric ward of Mercy General Hospital. He no longer asked to see the babies. He just sat, head bowed, eyes fixed on the hallway as if he could still see Ava and Elijah being wheeled away. Rebecca Monroe noticed. She walked past him on her rounds, always with a small nod or a quiet, "Morning, Thomas." Sometimes she brought him coffee. Once, a paperback mystery novel with a folded corner. But most of the hospital staff didn't know what to make of him. Some saw him as a hero, the man who saved 2 abandoned babies from death. Others weren't so sure. On the third morning, just after dawn, Thomas was approached by a security guard named Malcolm. Younger, buzz-cut, built like a linebacker, with a walk that demanded attention. "Sir," he said, voice firm, "I need you to come with me." Thomas looked up slowly, blinking the sleep from his eyes. He dozed off again on the waiting room couch. "Is there a problem?" he asked. Malcolm didn't answer, just motioned toward the elevators. Thomas followed without protest. They rode in silence to the administrative floor. The hallway here was different, quieter, colder. Polished floors, framed awards, the smell of lemon cleaner and red tape. He was led into a small room where Dr. Harris was already waiting. She wasn't wearing her white coat today. Her hands were clasped tightly on the table in front of her. Beside her sat a man in a gray blazer, early 40s, clean-shaven, a legal pad resting on his lap. "Thomas," Dr. Harris said. "This is Detective Jared Lynch from DPD." The man extended a hand. Thomas took it cautiously. "I just have a few questions," Detective Lynch said. "Won't take long." Thomas sat. Dr. Harris didn't. "Where were you between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. on the night of January 13th? Lynch began. Thomas frowned. "I don't remember exactly. Walking. Near Westwood Market, mostly. Anyone see you?" "I don't think so." Did you handle anything around the dumpster where you found the babies? I opened it, pulled them out, wrapped them in my coat. Did you see anyone else in the alley? No. Did you touch any of the trash bags or items near the infants? I didn't. I don't know. I might have. I wasn't thinking about that. I just found two babies, Lynch finished. Right. Thomas met his gaze. Yes. Lynch jotted something on his pad. I want to be clear. No one's accusing you of anything. But this is now part of an open investigation. And until we can rule out all possibilities. You think I put them there? Thomas asked softly. Lynch didn't answer. Dr. Harris cleared her throat. It's standard procedure, Thomas. Thomas's voice lowered. No, it's not. It's the procedure when someone like me is involved. A man with no ID, no address, no clean record. If I wore a suit, you'd be calling me a good Samaritan. Dr. Harris shifted uncomfortably. Lynch kept his eyes on the pad. We're waiting on fingerprint analysis. Yours are found on the infant's clothing and on the edge of the dumpster. That checks out, but we still need to be thorough. I have nothing to hide, Thomas said. Lynch nodded. Then we'll be in touch. The meeting ended. Thomas was escorted back to the waiting room, but the warmth he had begun to feel there was gone. Later that day, Rebecca found him sitting by the vending machines, staring into space. You look like someone ran over your soul, she said, kneeling in front of him. They think I did it, Thomas replied. They're doing their job, she said gently. He looked at her, eyes tired. No, they're doing what they've been trained to do, assume the worst, especially when a man doesn't look like he belongs. Rebecca sat beside him. You saved them. That's the truth. No one cares about truth. They care about proof. She didn't argue. She couldn't, because part of her, just a small, buried part, had asked that question too once. When she first saw him walk into the hospital, ragged and wild-eyed, holding two half-frozen babies. Do you want to know what I thought the moment I saw you? She asked quietly. He didn't answer. I thought, oh God, what did he do? Not, who did he save? That was my first thought. And I hate that. I hate that that's what I was trained to think. What society taught me to assume. Thomas turned to her. But I also watched you sit in this hallway for 4 days straight. I saw you talk to them through the glass. I saw your face when they were taken away. That's not something you fake. Thomas swallowed hard. It still doesn't change anything. They'll forget me. Ava and Elijah. The system will move on. I'll go back to pushing a cart and being invisible. Rebecca reached in her pocket and pulled out something folded. A photograph. I printed this from a nursery cam feed, she said, handing it to him. It was grainy black and white, but the image was clear. Thomas, leaning over the glass window of the nursery, eyes soft, lips moving as he whispered to the sleeping babies. I don't want them to forget you, Rebecca said. Thomas held the photo like it was glass. The next morning, he was gone. Not from the city, just from the hospital. He left behind the photo and a note scrawled in shaky penmanship. Tell them I didn't want to say goodbye, just to keep going. Rebecca kept the note. Dr. Harris never mentioned the investigation again. Lynch closed the file a week later. DNA evidence pointed to an underage mother, long gone. No charges filed. Ava and Elijah remained in foster care, their names changed by social services. But somewhere in the city, a man with no address, no title, and no past kept walking, waiting for the next sound he couldn't ignore. The streets of Detroit had a strange way of becoming familiar, even when they weren't. After a while, every alley, every corner store, every abandoned building started to blend into the same gray canvas. But for Thomas Grayson, certain places still held meaning. Memories etched so deep they clung to the brick and concrete like ivy. He found himself wandering back toward a neighborhood he hadn't seen in over a decade. The buildings were older now, crumbling under the weight of time and neglect, but he still recognized the faded awning of what used to be a bakery, now shuttered. Across the street stood a rusted mailbox with a number 427 scratched into it. That was the house where he'd raised Matthew. The windows were boarded up, the yard overgrown. The swing Linda had once painted blue now dangled by a single chain, creaking in the wind. Thomas didn't approach. He stood across the street, hands deep in his pockets, staring for a long time. Memories came uninvited. Matthew at age 7, running through the yard with a towel tied around his neck like a cape. Linda laughing from the porch, waving a peanut butter sandwich in the air like it was a medal. Thomas, younger and full of quiet joy, fixing a broken sprinkler in the grass. That life had died in stages. The worst part wasn't Linda's death. It was the silence that followed. Matthew had changed overnight. Grief hardened into anger. He slammed doors, skipped school, threw accusations like knives. Thomas, numb and broken, hadn't known how to hold his son together while his own world collapsed. The last conversation they had replayed in his mind like an unfinished sentence. "I needed you to save her," Matthew had yelled. "And you just gave up." Thomas had tried to explain. About the money, the treatments, the desperate prayers whispered into the night. But Matthew didn't want explanations. He wanted someone to blame. And Thomas, feeling already responsible, accepted the role. That night, Matthew had packed a backpack and walked out the door. No goodbye, no address, just the slam, the silence, and then years of absence. Now, standing across from that hollow house, Thomas wondered where his son had gone, if he was still angry, if he'd even remember the man who had once fixed his toy cars and sang lullabies off-key. Had he ever known the man who would one day pull 2 freezing infants from a dumpster? Thomas turned away, boots crunching on the icy sidewalk, and resumed his wandering. Over the next few weeks, he moved through the city with quieter steps. He spoke less, listened more. Something inside him had shifted, not in an explosive way, but like the slow cracking of ice under the weight of spring. He began collecting broken radios from the trash again. Old cassette players, fans, lamps, anything that once worked and now didn't. He took them to a small bench behind a community shelter where he sometimes slept. There, under a flickering outdoor light, he began to fix. Word spread. A woman brought a broken heater. A teenage boy brought a bicycle with a jam chain. Someone else asked him to fix an old record player for their grandmother. He didn't charge, just nodded, took the item, and returned it when it worked again. It wasn't about money. It was about purpose. He hadn't had one in years. And every time he repaired something, it felt like stitching together a small piece of himself. One evening, while working on a toaster, a young boy named Darius approached. 11, maybe 12, with wide eyes and a jacket 2 sizes too big. "Are you the fix-it guy?" Darius asked. Thomas looked up from his work. "I guess I am. My lamp stopped working. It was my dad's before he left." Thomas held out his hand. "Let's take a look." They sat together, hunched over the lamp under the dull light. Thomas showed Darius how to check the wires, test the bulb, replace the fuse. "Sometimes," he said, "things don't work not because they're broken, just misaligned." Darius nodded like he understood more than he let on. Before leaving, the boy asked, "Why do you do this?" "For free." Thomas hesitated. "Because someone once gave me a second chance," he said, even if they didn't know it. He didn't explain, didn't talk about Ava and Elijah, or the hospital, or the investigation that had quietly ended without apology. He just kept fixing. Every day, he left something repaired in the common room of the shelter. A working clock, a reassembled stroller, a radio that played Motown classics again. Each item was left without note. But people started calling him the Tinker. He never corrected them. But the babies, Ava and Elijah, remained in his thoughts. He didn't know where they had gone, if they'd been adopted, if their names had been changed. He only knew they were alive, and sometimes that was enough. Still, the ache lingered. In the quiet moments, when the city hushed and the sky turned to ash, he thought of Matthew. Not with bitterness, but with longing. The way a man might think of something he'd lost in a fire, knowing he'd never get it back, but still reaching for the smoke. On the eve of the 1-month anniversary since finding the babies, Thomas returned to the alley behind Westwood Market. Snow had fallen the night before, coating the dumpster in white. He approached slowly, footsteps muffled. In his hands, he carried a small package wrapped in a blue towel. Inside were 2 hand-knit beanies, stitched together by someone at the shelter, and a note. "To the babies who reminded me how to feel again." He placed it gently on the dumpster's lid, then stood there in silence. For a moment, the city disappeared. The wind stilled, and Thomas closed his eyes. He didn't pray. He just remembered. The sound of Ava's faint breath against his chest. The weight of Elijah's tiny hand wrapped around his finger. The warmth he hadn't felt in years. Then he turned, pulled his coat tighter, and walked away, into the night, into the cold, into whatever came next. Winter in Detroit had a way of turning time into a slow drip. Each day bled into the next, and the cold stretched out like a season that had forgotten how to end. For most, it was a season to endure. For Thomas, it was the first winter in years that felt like it meant something. He had no home, no family, and still slept in the corners of shelters or under awnings, but he had a purpose now, one that made his hands move and his heart stir. Fixing things had once been his trade. Now, it was his offering to the world, or maybe to himself. Word of the tinker spread slowly. It wasn't a nickname Thomas had chosen, but it stuck. Someone at the shelter had coined it, and now even volunteers used it when they passed him tools or parts. The shelter itself wasn't much. A two-story brick building on the corner of a forgotten block. Haven House sat between an abandoned laundromat and a liquor store with more bars than windows. Inside, it offered 40 beds, 2 hot meals a day, and a bulletin board filled with job listings, lost person flyers, and scraps of hope. Thomas staked out a spot near the back courtyard, where a broken picnic table and half-collapsed storage shed had been gathering dust for years. With permission from the staff, he cleaned out the shed, reinforced its sagging beams, and turned it into his workshop. He lined the walls with shelves made from discarded crates. Labeled jars held screws, nails, fuses, batteries. Someone donated a toolbox. A retired electrician brought in an old soldering kit. It was rough, cluttered, and barely insulated, but it breathed. It had a heartbeat, just like him. People came with their broken things. A single mother named Kendra brought a microwave with a faulty timer. A quiet man named Luis, who rarely spoke above a whisper, brought in a cracked radio. Darius came back too, this time with a broken electric fan and a question. "Can I help?" Thomas looked up from the workbench, studied the boy's eager face. "Know anything about circuitry?" "Nope." "Good. You'll learn it right." So they worked side by side. Thomas showed him how to test connections, solder wires, clean contact points. Darius was a quick study. He didn't ask too many questions, but he listened carefully. In the quiet between tasks, they shared small parts of themselves. Darius talked about his mom, who worked 2 jobs and still came home tired. About the brother he missed, locked up for something he wouldn't talk about. Thomas, in turn, talked about the radios he used to fix, about Linda's laugh, about the house with the blue swing. He didn't mention Matthew. Not yet. One evening, while repairing a space heater, Darius asked, "Do you ever miss being somebody?" Thomas looked up from the unit. "What do you mean?" "I mean like before, when you had a shop, a house, people who knew your name." Thomas thought about it. "I think I miss remembering who I was. That's different from being missed." Darius nodded like he understood. Around them, the city pulsed with cold and concrete. But inside the workshop, there was warmth, not just from a space heater, but from something harder to name. The small victories piled up. A lamp flickered back to life. A record player sang again. A little girl squealed when her talking teddy bear finally said, "I love you," after months of silence. People started leaving thank you notes on the door of the shed. Some slipped in cans of coffee, pairs of gloves, or half-eaten sandwiches wrapped in foil. A few even asked if Thomas could train them too. He never said no. One day, Rebecca showed up. She walked in like she belonged there, in her nurse's scrubs and snow-dusted boots, holding a bag of pastries. "You've been hiding," she said, handing him the bag. "Not hiding," Thomas replied. "Just rebuilding." Rebecca looked around the shed, then at the boy helping him sweep. "You've got an apprentice. Darius. He's smarter than I am. I believe that." They shared coffee on the back steps, watching snow fall over the courtyard. Rebecca filled him in on the babies, Ava and Elijah. She didn't have much information, only that they'd been placed together with a temporary foster family on the other side of the city. She didn't know if the names had been kept. The files were sealed now. Thomas listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "I don't need to know everything, just that they're okay." "They are," Rebecca assured him. "Because of you." He didn't answer. But that night, he left something on the steps of the hospital. 2 handcrafted toys, one a wooden rattle, the other a wind-up music box, wrapped in a scarf he had repaired, and a small note. For the lives that helped repair mine. Spring crept into the city, slow and stubborn. The snow melted, revealing the mud and mess beneath, but also signs of life. Thomas added a small garden beside the shed. Tomatoes, peppers, herbs. The shelter kids watered it like it was a miracle. One afternoon, while transplanting seedlings, Darius handed him a folded sheet of paper. "What's this?" Thomas asked. "A school project," Darius said, grinning. "We had to write about someone who changed our life." Thomas unfolded the paper. The title read, "The Man Who Fixes Everything But Doesn't Know He's Broken." He didn't finish reading it. He didn't need to. For the first time in years, Thomas felt the tightness in his chest loosen. Not because someone had thanked him, but because someone had seen him. He was still invisible to the city, still anonymous to the government, still lost to the systems that measured worth by credit scores and last names. But in that courtyard, in that garden, in that shed, he mattered, and that was enough. By late spring, Thomas had built something close to routine, a quiet rhythm that hummed beneath the noise of the city. Mornings began early, with him sweeping the shed, checking the tools, and setting out small tasks for the day. Sometimes Darius joined him. Sometimes others from his shelter stopped by to lend a hand or share a word. The garden had started to bloom, tiny bursts of green pushing through the soil like quiet rebellion. Tomatoes ripened in patches, and someone had painted a sign that read, "Tinker's Garden," decorated with crooked flowers and smudged fingerprints. There was no salary, no title, no recognition from anyone that mattered. But in his small world, Thomas had become a presence, solid, dependable, seen. So when the letter came, he didn't know what to make of it. It arrived on a Thursday morning, slipped into the stack of flyers and notices on the shelter's front desk. Rebecca was the one who found it on one of her regular visits and handed it to him as he was wiping grease from his hands. "It's addressed to you," she said, her eyebrows raised. "Not just the tinker. Your full name. Thomas Grayson." He stared at the envelope. Thick, cream-colored paper. His name written in careful, looping script. "No return address. Someone must have looked you up," she added. "This doesn't feel random." Thomas took it without a word, stepped into the shed, and sat at the workbench. His hands trembled slightly as he broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of heavy parchment, written in the same neat handwriting. "Dear Mr. Grayson, you once saved 2 lives. We never forgot. We would be honored if you joined us as our guest at the annual Legacy Foundation benefit. December 20th, 6 p.m. The Belmont Hall, 1432 Jefferson Avenue. No formal attire required. Just bring yourself. With gratitude, a friend." There was no signature, no name, no clue, just a memory reawakened like a pulse. Thomas read it 3 times. Then he folded it neatly and placed it back in the envelope. Rebecca was waiting outside. "Well," he handed her the letter. She read it slowly, then looked up. "Do you think it's them?" He nodded once. "Are you going?" "I don't know." "Why not?" "Because I'm not sure I belong in a place like that anymore." Rebecca crossed her arms. "Thomas, if this is what I think it is, it's not about belonging. It's about being remembered." He didn't answer, but for the next few days, the letter lived in his coat pocket. He read it in the early mornings and late at night, tracing the words with his thumb as if they might vanish. The Belmont Hall was not a place for people like him. He knew that. He had passed by it once, years ago, a grand old building with stained glass windows and marble columns. It hosted charity galas, political fundraisers, elegant weddings. He imagined himself walking through those doors with his frayed coat and scuffed boots, standing among people in tuxedos and heels, wondering which exit would be the least humiliating. Still, he couldn't throw the letter away. December 20th crept closer. He didn't tell Darius or anyone else at the shelter where he might be going, but he began to prepare quietly. He polished his old shoes using a rag and leftover hand lotion. He washed his best shirt, still 2 sizes too big, with a frayed collar, and mended a small tear near the cuff. Rebecca found him a navy coat at a second-hand shop, and he practiced standing straight in front of the mirror in the shelter's bathroom. On the morning of the event, he trimmed his beard, combed his hair, and folded the invitation into his inside pocket. At 5 o'clock, he took the bus. The seat was cold, the passengers silent. Outside, the city lights blinked on one by one, casting golden reflections on the pavement. When he arrived at Belmont Hall, the building was lit up like a cathedral. Through the tall windows, he saw people laughing, sipping champagne, music playing softly beneath the hum of conversation. He stood at the entrance for a long moment, the cold creeping up his back. Then a woman at the check-in table looked up and smiled. "Mr. Grayson?" He blinked. "Yes." She stood. "We've been expecting you." He followed her inside. The marble floors gleamed. A chandelier glittered overhead. Tables were dressed in white linens and gold trim. Waiters passed by with trays of wine and hors d'oeuvres. People turned to look, but not with judgment, not with suspicion. There was something else in their eyes. Recognition? He was guided to a seat near the stage. His name, Thomas Grayson, was printed on a place card in elegant script. He didn't know what to do with his hands. The room filled quickly. Hundreds of guests, dressed to the nines. A stage with a podium. A banner above read, "Legacy Foundation Annual Benefit, Honoring Quiet Heroes." As the lights dimmed, a young man in a dark gray suit stepped onto the stage. He looked familiar, though Thomas couldn't place him. He tapped the microphone. "Good evening," the man said. "My name is Elijah Taylor, and I'm honored to welcome you tonight. 20 years ago, my sister and I were left behind a grocery store dumpster, cold, alone, and dying." Thomas froze. Elijah's voice remained steady. "We don't remember that day, but we were told about it. About the man who didn't walk away. The man who wrapped us in his coat, carried us to safety, and sat outside our hospital room until he knew we would live." Next to Elijah, a young woman stepped forward. Her hair was pulled back, her dress a deep navy blue. Her eyes shone. "I'm Ava," she said simply. That man was never named in the news. He never came forward, but we found him. Elijah's gaze swept the crowd. "Tonight, we are here not just to raise funds for the future, but to honor the man who gave us one." Then together, they said, "Mr. Thomas Grayson, would you please join us on stage?" Thomas couldn't move. People turned. Applause erupted. A waiter touched his arm gently. "They're calling for you, sir." He stood slowly. His legs felt weak. As he walked toward the stage, his heart pounded, not with fear, but with something unfamiliar. Belonging. The walk to the stage felt longer than it was. Each step echoed like a drumbeat inside Thomas's chest. He could feel the eyes of hundreds on him, strangers in formal wear, clapping, smiling. Some stood, some wiped at their eyes. But for Thomas, the world narrowed to two faces, Elijah and Ava. They stood on the stage, side by side, tall and confident, but with something in their expressions that softened as he approached. A tenderness, a recognition. As Thomas reached the steps, Elijah extended a hand. "Mr. Grayson." Thomas hesitated, then took it. Elijah pulled him up gently, and Ava stepped forward, wrapping her arms around him in a hug that was both familiar and foreign. "I don't remember your face," she whispered, "but I've remembered your name since I could read." Thomas couldn't speak. His throat was thick with emotion. His hands trembled slightly as he looked at them, fully grown now, healthy, strong, alive. Elijah turned back to the crowd. "This is the man who saved our lives," he said. "When he had nothing, he gave us everything. Not because anyone was watching, not for credit, just because it was the right thing to do." A photo appeared on the screen behind them, a grainy image pulled from hospital security footage, showing Thomas in his old coat, cradling the two babies in his arms as he rushed through the emergency room doors. Gasps rippled through the audience. Then silence. "He didn't ask for thanks," Ava said. "He didn't even stay to be acknowledged. But without him, we wouldn't be here." Elijah continued. "Ava is now a pediatric heart surgeon. I'm a structural engineer. Together, we've started a nonprofit that builds safe, affordable housing for families in need. That work is our way of giving back. But tonight, we want to give back to the man who gave us our first chance." He turned to Thomas again, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You saved us, Mr. Grayson. Now let us do something for you." The screen behind them changed again, showing a modest but beautiful house. White siding, blue shutters, a small porch swing out front. A garden plot, a detached garage in the back. "This home is yours," Elijah said. "Fully paid for. In your name." Thomas stared at the image, uncomprehending. "No," he whispered. I couldn't." "You already did," Ava said, smiling. Elijah added, "There's more. A monthly stipend, medical coverage. And that garage? It's been converted into a full workshop, stocked with everything you might need to keep fixing things if you want to." Thomas took a shaky step back. His voice cracked. "Why me?" Ava answered, "Because you didn't wait for someone else to act. Because you believed our lives were worth saving when no one else did." The applause came again, louder, more insistent. Thomas wiped at his eyes. He had lived decades believing he had disappeared from the world, that he was invisible, disposable, a ghost moving through the streets. And now this. As the applause continued, a voice rose from the crowd. "Dad!" It was quiet at first, almost lost in the noise. "Dad!" Thomas turned sharply. A man was moving through the tables. Early 40s, brown hair, gray at the edges, eyes locked on him with a stunned expression. He was dressed in a simple suit. No tie. The room went silent again. Thomas squinted. For a moment, his mind couldn't catch up. Then the voice, its cadence, its rhythm, cut through the years. "Matthew." The man stopped just before the stage. "I heard your name. I didn't believe it. I thought I was imagining it." Thomas took a step forward. "Al, how did you—" "I saw the story," Matthew said. "About the babies. About the man who saved them. I looked into it. Tracked the hospital. I had to know." He shook his head. "All these years, I thought I left a broken man. But you were still saving lives." Thomas didn't move. His hands hung at his sides. "I blamed you," Matthew continued. "For Mom. For everything. I thought you just gave up. But you didn't. You kept going. You kept giving. I didn't know where to find you," Thomas whispered. "I didn't want to be found," Matthew said. "Until now." Silence stretched between them. Then Matthew stepped forward, reaching for his father's hand. "I'm sorry," he said. Thomas took his hand. Neither man said anything else for a long moment. Elijah and Ava stood back, watching quietly. In that moment, the stage, filled with light, applause, and memory, became something more. A place of forgiveness, of completion, a place where a man who had once lost everything now stood surrounded by it. The rest of the evening blurred. Thomas sat at a table near the front. Elijah and Ava joined him, along with Matthew, who barely let go of his father's side. Waiters brought food. People came by to shake his hand, to thank him, to tell him he was an inspiration. He didn't feel like one. He still felt like a man who'd simply done what was necessary. But maybe he thought that was what real heroism was, doing the right thing when no one was watching, when no one would thank you, and when the only reward was knowing you'd done what you could. As the night wore on, Elijah and Ava stood once more to thank the guests for their donations, which had far exceeded the fundraising goal. Matthew leaned close to his father. "I want to visit," he said. "To talk. Really talk." "I like that," Thomas said. Back at the shelter, the garden would still be growing. Darius would be wondering where he'd gone. The workbench would sit quiet, waiting. But tonight, in a grand ballroom beneath a crystal chandelier, Thomas Grayson was seen. And not as the tinker. Not as a homeless man. Not even as a hero. He was seen as a father. As a man who mattered. As family. The morning after the benefit, Thomas awoke in a hotel room unlike any place he had stayed in for years. The sheets were crisp, the heat was steady, and the silence was the kind that came from insulation, not abandonment. He lay there for several minutes, unsure of whether he was still dreaming. It was Matthew who had walked him up to the room the night before. After the event ended and the ballroom lights dimmed, Elijah and Ava had offered him a ride, but Matthew insisted. "Let me," he had said, almost pleading, "let me be the one to take care of you, just this once." They hadn't spoken much on the way. Words were still delicate between them, like thread too fine to tug. But when they reached the hotel, Matthew handed him a key card and said, "Rest. We'll talk tomorrow. No more running." Now, as sunlight crept across the patterned carpet, Thomas sat up slowly. His knees ached. His body felt heavy. But inside, something was shifting, like an old engine being coaxed back to life. He rose, dressed in the same clothes from the night before, and stepped into the hallway. The carpet muffled his footsteps. In the lobby, no one looked at him twice. For the first time in years, he wasn't out of place. At breakfast, Elijah was waiting for him with a smile and 2 coffees. "We thought you might need something hot," he said, sliding a cup across the table. "Cream and sugar already in. Rebecca told us how you like it." Thomas accepted it, unsure whether to laugh or cry. Ava arrived moments later, carrying a folder. "Paperwork," she said with a grin. "Nothing painful, just the house deed, workshop layout, healthcare forms, and a few things for your records." Thomas stared at the folder as if it might explode. "We'll walk you through it," Elijah said gently. "You don't have to do anything today." They ate breakfast together, the 3 of them. It wasn't rushed. There was no big speech, no grand promises. Just quiet conversation, smiles, questions about his favorite tools, his favorite meals, his favorite songs. It felt strange to be asked about preferences again, to matter. Later that afternoon, they drove together to the house. It was just like the photo. White siding, blue shutters, a swing on the porch. The yard was small but clean, and in the back stood a detached garage, recently painted and freshly roofed. Inside, the house was modest, 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a small kitchen, and a living room filled with light. Everything had been furnished simply, tastefully. Nothing extravagant, just warm. Thomas stood in the doorway, unable to cross the threshold. "This is yours," Ava said. "No rent, no mortgage, no conditions." He shook his head slowly. "I don't know how to live in a place like this anymore." "That's okay," Elijah replied. "You'll learn again." In the garage, the transformation was complete. Pegboards lined the walls, holding rows of screwdrivers, pliers, wrenches. A workbench sat beneath a wide window, and beneath it were tool drawers labeled by category. There were soldering irons, voltage meters, boxes of spare parts. Even a small stool with a worn cushion, one that looked very much like the one Thomas used to have at his old shop. He reached out and ran his fingers along the edge of the bench. "How did you know?" he whispered. Ava smiled. "Rebecca," and a little detective work. Thomas sat on the stool, his legs unsteady. He didn't speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was low. "You didn't have to do all this. You didn't have to save us," Elijah replied. That night, Thomas slept in a real bed for the first time in nearly 2 decades. The quiet wasn't threatening. It was peaceful. The warmth didn't come from layered coats or body heat trapped under bridges. It came from safety. He woke early as always. Old habits didn't die just because the mattress was soft. He made coffee. He sat on the porch. And as the sun rose, he watched the neighborhood come alive. Dog walkers, joggers, children with backpacks. No one looked twice at him. Over the next few weeks, he eased into the new rhythm. He started in the garage, testing tools, organizing parts, restoring an old radio Ava had found at a flea market. Word spread faster than he expected. Neighbors dropped by with broken fans, lamps, clocks. Someone brought a busted air conditioner. Another brought an antique toaster. He never charged, just smiled, fixed what he could, and sent them on their way. Kids came by too, curious, wide-eyed. One of them, a girl named Jasmine, asked if he could teach her how to fix a toy drone. "Only if you promise not to crash it again," he joked. She grinned. No promises. Sometimes Elijah and Ava visited together. Sometimes separately. They brought groceries, updates on their work, and stories about their own lives. They sat on the porch, sometimes talking, sometimes not. They didn't fill the silence. They shared it. One afternoon, as he and Matthew worked side by side repairing a lawnmower for the neighbor, Thomas asked, "Why did you come back?" Matthew looked up. "Because I realized I left without understanding. I failed you." "No," Matthew said. "You hurt. You didn't know how to carry both grief and me at the same time. I get that now." Thomas nodded, eyes wet. Matthew added, "We both lost Mom. But I let that mean I had to lose you too. I was wrong." They didn't hug. Not right then. But something settled between them. A truce. A beginning. And as spring gave way to summer, the house that had once felt like too much began to feel just right. In the evenings, Thomas sat on the porch swing, a cup of tea in his hand, a warm breeze stirring the wind chimes. Sometimes Jasmine rode her bike past and waved. Sometimes Ava brought fresh herbs from her own garden. Sometimes Elijah stayed late, working on a project in the garage. And sometimes Thomas simply sat. He wasn't running anymore. He wasn't fixing things because he had to. He was living, not just surviving, not just enduring, living. And for the first time in a long time, redemption no longer felt like a distant idea. It felt like home. By midsummer, Thomas Grayson had found a life he never imagined reclaiming. Not one of grandeur, but one of quiet completeness. His days were filled with the small routines of ordinary dignity, sweeping his workshop floor, fixing clocks and radios, tending to the tomatoes in his garden. He had become, in his own way, a landmark in the neighborhood. Children knew him by name. Neighbors brought him peaches in brown paper bags. One woman even asked him to officiate her backyard wedding. He declined, of course, but not without a laugh. "You're the most honest man I know," she'd said. "That should count for something." And maybe it did. One evening in early July, he received an invitation from Ava and Elijah. The Legacy Foundation, the nonprofit the siblings had co-founded, was hosting another event, a community block party for the launch of their newest housing project. This one would include 20 single-family homes in the East Side, built for families transitioning out of homelessness. Thomas didn't usually attend public gatherings. The gala at Belmont Hall had been more than enough limelight for a lifetime. But this event was different. Casual, local, surrounded by the very people whose lives mirrored the one he'd once lived. So he agreed. The event was held in an open lot cleared for future development. Banners fluttered in the breeze. Children chased balloons across the grass. A stage had been set up at one end, where a live jazz trio played soft tunes. The smell of barbecue lingered in the air, mixing with sunblock and the scent of newly cut wood from the construction area. Thomas arrived in a pressed shirt and the same navy blue coat he had worn to Belmont Hall. He greeted volunteers, shook hands with old acquaintances, and stood quietly near the back as Ava took the stage to speak. Her voice was steady, filled with conviction. "This land will be more than housing," she said. "It will be hope, rebuilt from the ground up. Because everyone deserves a place to belong." Elijah spoke next, sharing the architectural plans and future vision. He had grown more comfortable with public speaking since that night at the gala, but his eyes still flickered to Thomas now and then, a silent thread of gratitude running between them. After the speeches, the crowd dispersed into smaller conversations. Children returned to their games. Music resumed. Thomas wandered toward the edge of the gathering, near a display of photos from past projects. He admired a black-and-white image of a family standing in front of a newly built home, smiles wide and proud. Then he heard it. "Mr. Grayson." The voice was tentative. Male, polite but cautious. Thomas turned. A man in his late 20s stood before him, wearing khakis and a Legacy Foundation polo. He held a clipboard in one hand and a volunteer badge around his neck. But it wasn't the clothes that caught Thomas's attention. It was the face. Familiar. Sharp jaw. Deep-set eyes. The same mole just above the right eyebrow. Thomas blinked, unsure if his memory was playing tricks on him. The man extended his hand. "My name's Daniel. I think you knew my mother." Thomas took the handshake, still confused. "I'm sorry. Her name was Rachel Carter. She was 17 when she gave birth to twins. Left them behind a grocery store. She never told anyone. But years later, after a rough time in rehab, she started opening up." Thomas went still. Daniel continued. "She passed away 2 years ago. But before she died, she talked a lot about those babies. Said someone saved them. Said she never forgot." Thomas's voice was barely audible. "She was their birth mother?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah, my half-siblings. I found out last year. I've been volunteering here ever since, hoping maybe one day I'd cross paths with them." Thomas looked over toward the stage, where Ava and Elijah were speaking to a group of donors. "They're here," Thomas said. "They're good. Better than good." "I know," Daniel replied. "I've been following their work. I haven't had the courage to approach them yet." "Why now?" Daniel hesitated. "Because I saw your photo on the board. From the hospital. I recognized you. She had that picture in a shoebox. The man with the coat. Thomas swallowed hard. I didn't know what to say, Daniel added. But I needed to say something. Because, even if she made a mistake, she regretted it every day. She wanted them to know she wasn't a monster. Just a scared kid who didn't know what to do. Thomas nodded slowly. They'll understand. One day, Daniel's eyes glistened. Do you think they'd want to meet me? I can't speak for them, Thomas said. But I think they'd want the truth. You don't have to be perfect to be forgiven. A pause. Then Thomas added, I wasn't. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and lanterns were strung between trees, Thomas introduced Daniel to Elijah and Ava. The conversation began awkwardly, shaky, uncertain, but as the hours passed, something shifted. Ava listened closely, her arms crossed at first, then slowly unfolding. Elijah asked questions, thoughtful but without judgment. Thomas stood back, letting the moment belong to them. He watched the siblings talk, laugh, share photographs, pass a soda, come between them like old friends. It was not easy, not instant, but it was a beginning, and Thomas understood that beginnings didn't have to be loud. Sometimes, they were just a nod across a table. A hand extended. A door opened. When the event ended and the crowd thinned, Ava walked over to Thomas. You always seem to be at the right place, don't you? Thomas smiled. Not always, but I try to show up when it counts. She hugged him. You gave us more than life, she whispered. You gave us the chance to know where we came from. He didn't answer, just held the embrace a little longer. That night, back at his house, Thomas sat on the porch swing under a soft yellow porch light. The street was quiet. The stars, faint but present, blinked above the rooftops. He thought about Rachel, about Matthew, about Elijah, Ava, Daniel, about the ways lives tangle and unravel and come back together. Redemption wasn't a straight path. It was a series of turns, pauses, confessions, and quiet choices. And sometimes, if you were lucky, it came full circle. Autumn arrived with a kind of grace Thomas had never noticed before. The trees along his street shifted from green to gold, their leaves falling in soft waves across the lawn. The air carried the crisp scent of turning seasons, and in the stillness of early mornings, Thomas often found himself listening, to birds, to wind, to the steady hum of life that he had once walked past without hearing. It had been nearly a year since that night behind the dumpster. Nearly a year since he had wrapped 2 freezing infants in his coat and stumbled into Mercy General. Nearly a year since his life had shifted from survival to something deeper. Living. There were no headlines now. No more spotlights or benefit galas. Just days. Simple, full days. Each morning, Thomas opened the door to his garage workshop, greeted by the familiar scent of oil and sawdust. He would sweep the floor, organize tools, and set out project for the day. Some were brought to him by neighbors. Others were dropped off anonymously on the porch. A broken lamp, a damaged toaster, a clock that no longer ticked. He fixed what he could. For the rest, he gave it his best try. Kids from the neighborhood still came by. Jasmine had become a regular visitor, bringing her friends and their gadgets, asking endless questions about wires and circuits. You should teach a class, she told him once. I barely know what I'm doing myself, Thomas replied with a laugh. That's not true, she said. You fix things. You fix people. He didn't argue, because maybe she was right. On Fridays, Elijah and Ava still visited, sometimes separately, often together. They'd bring groceries, tools, books, or sometimes nothing at all but conversation. Ava would sit in the kitchen with a cup of tea and ask questions about his past. Not probing, just curious. She wanted to know about Linda, about the radio shop, about what life had been like before everything unraveled. Elijah preferred the workshop, where the two would work quietly side by side, their conversations few but meaningful. Sometimes Daniel joined them too. The relationship between the 3 siblings had grown cautiously but steadily, each step forward made possible by honesty and patience. There were awkward silences, sure, and moments of discomfort. But there was also laughter now, shared jokes, and inside stories. They were building something together, brick by emotional brick. And Matthew, he came by every Sunday. It had started with short visits, a walk around the garden, coffee on the porch, a shared memory, carefully unwrapped. Now, they spent hours together. They repaired lawnmowers, sorted old photographs, talked about Linda and what she might have thought of all this. She would have hated the fuss, Thomas said one afternoon, chuckling. But she would have loved them. Matthew nodded. And she would have forgiven us both a long time ago. One Sunday, Matthew showed up with a box under his arm. Inside was an old transistor radio, rusted at the edges but familiar. Found it in a pawn shop, he said. It's yours, isn't it? Thomas turned it over in his hands. It was the last thing I sold before I lost the shop. He placed it on the workbench, opened the back, and began to tinker. Matthew watched silently. Then, softly, he asked, "Do you ever wish things had been different?" Thomas paused. "I used to," he said. "Used to wish I could rewind it all, make different choices. But then, none of this would have happened. None of them. None of this life." He looked up at his son. "I think sometimes the cracks are what let the light in." Matthew didn't respond, but he stayed. And that was enough. As winter returned, Haven House, the shelter where Thomas had once slept, reached out. They were creating a new outreach program, teaching basic repair skills to unhoused teens and young adults, offering a path to employment and purpose. They wanted Thomas to lead it. At first, he refused. "I'm not a teacher," he said. "I'm just a man who found a toolbox." But Rebecca, now director of the program, smiled knowingly. "You're more than that. You've always been more." So he agreed. Once a week, he walked into a small community room filled with kids who reminded him of who he used to be, scraped up, tired, skeptical. He taught them how to strip wires, solder joints, replace fuses. But more than that, he taught them how to care, how to take something broken and believe it could work again. Not everything was fixed. Not every student stayed. Not every lamp lit up. But Thomas kept showing up, because someone had to. One snowy afternoon, as he closed up the garage, Jasmine handed him a small notebook. Inside were pages filled with drawings, diagrams, and notes. "I want to build things like you," she said. He knelt beside her. "You already do." "Not yet," she replied. "But I will." And Thomas believed her. Because if life had taught him anything, it was this. The world could be cruel and cold, full of loss and silence. But it could also be soft if you knew where to listen. It could be kind if you knew how to offer something back. And sometimes, all it took to change everything was a choice. To stop walking. To hear a cry. To take off your coat. To try. In the end, no one remembered Thomas Grayson for the shop he'd lost, or the mistakes he'd made, or the years he spent invisible. They remembered him for what he did when no one was watching. For what he gave without promise of return. For the lives he saved. For the lives he helped rebuild. And though he never thought of himself as a hero, to many, he was the man who fixed the world, one broken thing at a time.